Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey, everybody, it's Jared. Welcome to another episode of All Things Crime. Appreciate you listening, watching, however you are getting this information. I'm really excited that you're here. I appreciate all of you that have subscribed. So if you haven't subscribed, take the opportunity right now and hit that subscribe button. And then the little bell will notify you whenever a new episode launches. So that's important too. So also would appreciate if some of you or all of you could write me a rating. Give me a rating on whatever platform you're on, YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, wherever it is. So that would surely help too. All right. Well, this morning we have an awesome guest. I've been doing some research on him, and this is one of those interesting experiences where law enforcement, a law enforcement officer, actually kind of criticizes the law enforcement process and part of it at least, and that's obviously to do that. We criticize in order to make things better, and that's definitely why my guest is on with us today. His name's Shannon Borer, and Shannon, I welcome to the show. First of all, appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And I wanted to read a little excerpt from he's written a book, and it's called Judicial Soup. Now that alone, I think, is an interesting title. But I first want to get to know you a little bit better, Shannon, and I want the audience to hear this. So you served 27 years in the Maryland State Police. Following retirement, you taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico. And your last full-time position was for the Maryland Police Training Commission as a firearms range master. So you've written numerous law enforcement articles, and you write a monthly column for the local newspaper. An MBA, nice, educated, and you're seen as an expert witness on the use of force in both state and federal courts. Now, I imagine 27 years with the Maryland State Police, you've seen it all.
Well, you would think you would. And until I had the cause to write this book, I thought I knew a lot. But you find out there's a lot that you don't know.
Well, fair enough. But 27 years of experience in anything, and you're going to get good at it. I mean, the sheer fact that you survived it is one, especially with law enforcement nowadays. It is a dangerous occupation. And how many years ago did you retire?
From the state police, I retired back in the 90s.
Okay.
And
a little safer back then, right?
I thought it was. Yeah. I'm 77 now, so I've officially been retired from any full-time work for over 12 years now.
All right. So in the last 12 years, especially, I imagine you've seen some pretty drastic changes, especially there in Maryland.
It's hard to imagine the changes. And I'll start by saying that the first police cars that we had, and for many years, there was no outside speaker. There was no outside radio. You had a single dome light, stop fender light. I mean, there's the changes in the vehicles themselves. I'm sure if I got in a vehicle today, I probably couldn't start it, wouldn't know how to drive
it. Yeah. Well, it's, I imagine I'll feel that way pretty shortly. And, when I see my kids driving certain vehicles, but yeah, technology has definitely changed things. And, I don't know if you know anything about what I do, but I'm more in the DNA collection world. And so, DNA has changed law enforcement and especially investigations just so dramatically in the last 20 years. It's just incredible. So yeah, technology it's almost like a hockey stick. It's moving up in such a rapid rate that, the cars are getting better. The cars are, faster, but they have all this technology just in the cars, the equipment itself, radios and your ability to triangulate. It's just incredible what technology is doing for law enforcement. But in the end, and I hope you would agree with this, that I think no matter what kind of technology you're surrounded with, ultimately the decision has to be with the individual, and hopefully that individual is trained enough that and they have enough experience that they can deal with whatever situation they're in.
I agree with that, and I'd like to add that the primary way to do that is how you deal with individuals one-on-one. That's the same as it was in the 60s as it is now. How you talk to people, how you interact with them, it has a lot to do with your success or failure, and also the threats or non-threats, you might say.
Well, as you transitioned out of the full time with Maryland State Police, you went into Quantico, correct?
Yes.
And what
I
were
was
you doing there?
I was with the FTU, the Firearms Training Unit, but I was working with the Behavioral Science Unit before I went down there. There's 3 studies that were done: killed in the line of duty. The second study was in the line of fire, and the third study was violent encounters. I was helping the people that worked in the Behavioral Science Unit with selection of cases on the second study. On the third study, I was listed on the Institutional Review Board, as an interviewer. We would interview officers and offenders. And there was a fourth study that never had enough cases to be published. But trying to look at events, violent encounters between police and the suspects, is like looking at auto accidents. In other words, how do you prevent the violent encounters from occurring? That was the purpose of the studies. And even after I left Quantico, I was still working with them on that. And then after retiring full-time, I taught part of the Valor program, the prevention of violence against law enforcement officers and officer resiliency around the country. That was a real honor to be part of that program. I do believe that the majority of officers out there are honest and hardworking. They're not looking for extra kudos. They just want to do the job and do it right. But when you have 700,000 officers, obviously you can have some that probably shouldn't be there.
Yeah, well, that's and it's amazing. I've interviewed enough cops and investigators on this program that I've never seen, and I think every cop, for the most part, that has any level of self-awareness is also aware that whatever actions they do reflects on the entire profession. And I've never seen another profession where that's the case. It's if a doctor amputates the wrong leg, or operates on the wrong knee, which I've heard of, which I had my left ACL worked on, a number of years ago, and they wrote all over my leg and then wrote a big X on my right leg, just to make sure that the doctor knew which knee he was repairing and which one he wasn't. So, that kind of stuff happens. But the point is, nobody stops going to the doctor just because, one doctor operates on the wrong leg. And so their profession, they're kind of isolated from each other. Even when one bad apple goes in there and screws something up and sometimes even, kills a patient from their neglect. If a police officer does anything even remotely close to that, the entire profession is demonized. And that's one of the things that I've never been able to fully, wrap my head around. And I'm wondering if you have, especially when you were with that behavioral unit, did you have any kind of insights into that?
We were trying to get a profile of an officer that's more likely to be assaulted and an offender that's more likely to assault the officer. And there was some common traits there, but there wasn't a definite thing.
Okay.
As far as what you were talking about, I mean, we've had volunteer firemen that have set fires, but we don't condemn the fire department. I think that honesty is not a socioeconomic level thing. And I think dishonesty is the same way. And the police are basically reflective of society for the most part. That's where we come from.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I do agree with you that seems to be an easy way to pick on it. The book Judicial Soup takes a different tact in a sense that it looks at the whole system and how it operates together. And like you talked about DNA, there's a number of cases in the book because I have a summary of a case behind each chapter that use DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing how many people have been in jail for so long. I mean, 20, 30, 40 years, and they were innocent. That was the thing that really surprised me about writing the book. I knew we had some innocent people in jail. I just didn't know how many. And I still don't.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure anybody does, to be honest. And it's, there's some cases that are on appeal that really shouldn't be. And there's other cases where you look at the suspect, the person that's been convicted, and you're just like, there is no way. One such example, there was a gentleman named Chris Tapp. He was convicted in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Uh, and I can't remember the exact date, but I want to say 1998 was when he was convicted. The victim, Angie Dodge, was killed in 96, and he served 20 years. So from the time he was basically 19 to 39, he was in prison and didn't do it. And DNA was what basically got him out. And then familial DNA is how the real killer was caught. And yeah, that was one of those cases that pretty famous. It's gotten around quite a bit. 2020 has done a bunch of stuff, but yeah, it's interesting when you look at how the judicial system, including the interrogators, ramrodded Chris into basically pleading guilty and confessing to the crime when he wasn't even there. But he was a naive 18-year-old kid and thought he could trust the police that were talking to him, and they just wore him down. It was just amazing. There's a number of people that have looked at that, the interview tapes. There's like 40 hours of interview tapes, and they just shake their heads. I mean, back in the 90s, I'm sure you at least saw or heard about some of these things. The 80s and 90s are kind of like the good cop, bad cop type of interview scenarios. And yeah, where, one guy would be his friend and the next guy would be like, hey, you did it, man, just confess. And yeah, I don't think those tactics are used very often anymore.
I hope not. In the book, there's a case from the South where a man is convicted of murder. This is one of those summary cases.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason he's convicted, and I'm not going to give the names right now, but they find a gun in his mother's home and they match the bullets to the gun. And that's the primary evidence that convicted him. So he's in jail, I want to say for 16 years when his attorneys request the gun and the bullets to test. And he hires 3 ballistic experts. All of the experts say not only did the bullets not come from this gun, they didn't come from one gun. So the expert that testified at his trial was obviously not an expert.
Mm.
But then it took another 13 or 14 years for them to retry him. And when the Supreme Court said you have to retry him, they finally said, we're not going to try you. So they knew the evidence wouldn't hold up for almost 14 years.
Mm.
And that's the sad part. In other words, there's a case in the Midwest in the book also where they're trying a young man, for rape of a young girl. And the judge at the trial says the man is not guilty. He's being let free. And this was the 3rd time they were trying him when the DNA evidence was known. The 3rd time. He had written a confession similar to what you're talking about. And he was a young man, had some limited abilities. And when they showed the confession to the prosecutor said no, and he makes all the corrections. So they go back and interview him and make the corrections. And then the prosecutor says, yeah, now we'll try him. We tend to look at police and judicial reform, but we don't look at the attorneys sometimes. We don't look at the judges. And they're just as human as police are, and they have problems too. And sometimes when you go down one road and you're looking for it, you put blinders on, you don't see anything to the left or right.
Right. Yeah, and it's sad. Um, I think our entire judicial system is oriented around protecting the defendant, and yet I think over time that is kind of worn down, and so the defendant doesn't have. I mean, there's so many cases now, and I don't know. I maybe you have some insight into this because it's really disheartening to see where there are people that are being convicted, and some of them they shouldn't even ever go to trial. And it's you look at it and you're like, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the prosecutorial discretion that a lot of these DAs have, they should have, but at the same time, um, I don't know. It's a I think this is an ongoing discussion that may never end. But based on your research and uh, I'm there is a core story to Judicial Soup, correct? Your book.
Yes.
Why
The
don't you, yeah? Why don't you talk about?
protagonist,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
the protagonist was Heath Patrick Thomas. He was an ICE agent, and he had been employed for 19 years with ICE. Before that, he had been in the Navy, and he was a good man. He was in Washington, D.C., where he was assigned, and he went out to dinner with his girlfriend. And he knew he was going to be drinking, but he carried a gun.
Mm-hmm.
It was explained in court that when he was a young officer, his supervisor was killed in a bar fight with a knife, and he wasn't armed. In the federal system, as in most state systems, you can carry a gun off duty, but you're not supposed to consume alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
However, consuming alcohol when you're carrying a gun as a police officer or a federal officer either is not a crime. It's a violation of a rule.
Mm-hmm.
So in this particular case, the group stopped for a nightcap at an historic bar in Georgetown. The service was very poor. They were there a little over an hour, and his girlfriend said it's time to leave. He goes to pay the bill, and the bartender and barmaid are basically ignoring him. So he sees a man he believes to be the manager, and he approaches him. When he approaches him, he says, are you the manager? He says, yes. And he said, do you speak Spanish? The man looks Spanish to him. So Heath proceeds to tell him about the poor service and the fact that he can't pay his bill in Spanish. When he gets done, the manager says something to the effect, if you don't like it, I'm going to call the police. And Heath, in frustration, raises his hand and says, I am an effing police officer. And then he turns around and goes back to the bar. As he gets to the bar, the way he described it, he's hit from the rear. A bouncer picks him up, wraps his arms around him, and carries him over 40 feet out to the outside. As he's being carried, he realizes that his gun inside his waist is moving. So as soon as he's released, he puts his right foot forward and reaches for the gun. The bouncer grabs the top of the gun with his left hand, and his right arm goes around Heath's waist, and there's a struggle for the weapon. The bouncer, in this case, told the police when they came that he set Heath down. He backed up 3 feet, and Heath turned with gun in hand to point it at him. But he grabbed the gun before it could be pointed at him. Now, when I read that, I thought to myself, and this is in the book, well, that might happen in the movies, but that's not reality.
Mm-hmm.
You have action-reaction models, and you have the stimulus, reaction time, and response. And if you have two people boxing in a ring and one throws a jab and the other parries it, that's understandable. You see it coming, you expect it. But if they're walking down the street and one sucker punches the other, he's going to get hit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this is. I mean, he didn't know a gun was coming. In fact, during the court demonstration with Heath's defense attorney, he played the role of Heath. And the bouncer, he set him behind him 3 feet, as he said, and he turned around with a gun. Well, he could never grab it in time. It was demonstrated in court that it could not have occurred that way. In any event, there were a lot of problems, and this comes to the title of Judicial Soup. A lot of little problems, some big. And those little problems by themselves are not bad. if anybody spends any time in court, you know that sometimes you listen to the defense and you listen to the prosecution and you say, are they talking about the same case? And in this case, there was a lot of that. The problem was there was so much of it that it takes the court in the wrong direction. So you have a criminal justice soup, and what you get out of it is what you put into it. And there were some major problems also. The defense attorney tried to impeach a witness, and the judge ignored what the defense attorney was saying. And it was obviously the witness should have been impeached. He lied either in the courtroom or in his grand jury testimony when he gave conflicting testimony. And I'm not just talking about little things. In the grand jury, he said that he tried to fight with the bouncer. In the courtroom, he says, well, I didn't see his interaction with the bouncer. And the bouncer is asked, did you know him before this? Did you see him fighting with anybody? No. Did you see him arguing with anybody? Well, he was sort of like trying to explain something. He was talking, but he was talking in Spanish. I didn't know what he was saying. So there's just a whole lot to that.
Mm-hmm.
And halfway through the trial, and this was an 8-day trial, I said to Heath, you may have to appeal this. You could just see it going in the wrong direction. And then the judge, I was supposed to be testifying one day, and the judge said he put the cart before the horse and excused me, and they told me to go out in the hallway. And for a long time, they argued whether I should testify or not. The reason that's given in the transcripts is Heath had not testified, and they felt that until he testified, I shouldn't. Well, if you're charged with a crime, you don't have to testify. You don't have to prove your innocence. The state has to prove your guilt. So in my mind, I thought, well, if he doesn't testify, does that mean I can't testify? So then he let me testify, but he also limited the testimony to what happened after the gun was out. In other words, after they're fighting for the gun. Well, that goes to the case itself. In fact, in the appeals case, the appellate board said the expert should have been allowed to testify, but because the outcome wouldn't have changed, it's all right. It's not a big mistake. Well, they don't know what I would have said.
Yeah. How can they possibly say that the outcome wouldn't have changed? They don't know that.
They not only said that, they said also I wasn't there. And so in the book, I said something to the effect, well, they weren't there either. It's like going down the wrong road and you're speeding because you don't want to be late. You don't know where you're at. I've never seen anything like that written. So the more I wrote into this book, the more I looked into it, and I realized that having somebody charged with illegally pointing a gun at somebody is not a major offense. It's not a big crime show type story. So that's when I started looking for these other cases that would relate to what Heath's case was. In other words, how he looked at it. And I tried to feed them into the story, but it just didn't look right. That's when I decided to put a summary behind each one. And I would say at least 2/3 of these, you can read that and you can read how something happened to these people that also happened to Heath. And if we have hundreds of cases, which we do, of false imprisonment and false convictions for serious crimes, how many lesser crimes are like that?
Right.
I was talking to an attorney who was doing some work for him, and he asked me how the book was coming. And this is about the time I decided to put these summaries in there. And I says, I'm trying to collect some summaries of cases where people were convicted and they're really innocent that could relate to Heath's case. And he said to me, you want some more cases? It's like,
and he
really?
was the defense attorney or a prosecutor?
He's a former federal prosecutor, and I was a defense attorney, right? But he had knowledge of a lot of cases that I guess he thought that shouldn't have been prosecuted or wrongfully convicted. I think a lot of times, if you're in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, and you're arrested and you didn't do the crime or commit the crime, but you're allowed to plead guilty just so you don't miss work, I could see where a lot of people would do that for minor offenses.
Yeah.
And then later, when they apply for a job where you have to have some kind of security, they would find out that trespass or whatever it was they pled to keeps them from getting another job. You can just see it. That one thing that surprised me about these cases, the extra cases, is so many times when the judge or the juries, not the juries, the prosecutor would withhold evidence, that kind of stuff. And when you talked earlier about the police being responsible for everything, how we held responsible. If you're a prosecuting attorney and you withhold evidence intentionally, should you not be responsible for that also? There was a case in Texas where a man, he's a supermarket manager, and he goes out to dinner with his wife. He comes back, they go to bed. He gets up the next morning to go to work, and he leaves her a note saying, thank you for dinner and so forth. But he also says in the note, I wish we had made love last night.
Hmm.
So while he's at work, a man comes in and kills his wife, rapes her, and bludgeons her in his own bed. He has a 3-year-old son that's there also. And he said the son said a stranger came in and hurt my mommy. So this prosecutor prosecutes him, but withholds evidence, a lot of evidence.
Including
so the
that
man
note,
is in
I
jail.
imagine.
Huh?
Including that note, I imagine.
The note is how he prosecuted him. He said that he killed his wife because she wouldn't make love with him.
Oh, geez.
But he withheld a bloody bandana, which was on the across the street, which had her DNA on it and somebody else's DNA. He withheld the fact that there was a suspicious van parked out back. He even withheld the fact that the 3-year-old son said it was a stranger that killed my mommy. And he also withheld the fact about some credit cards being used like a couple hundred miles away from her. So he's in jail for 25 years. And his lawyers finally get the evidence released and they find this out. Now this prosecuting attorney is a judge.
Hmm.
So he is charged with this with a state crime, and he spends 10 days in jail, and he retires and gives up any practice he has. Now, 10 days versus 25 years.
Wow.
And in the meantime, the person that did commit this crime killed another woman in the same manner.
Hmm.
And if you're going to have the responsibility, as a police does, who also has the authority to have that responsibility, then the prosecutors and the court system should have the same. I'm not saying that we're all human. We can make mistakes. As somebody once said, sometimes it's hard to be human. But if you intentionally withhold the evidence, and you see a lot of that in many of these cases, and you see experts testifying that really aren't experts. And that's the sad part, like the gun I told you about with the bullets. And it was a learning experience for me. As you know, when you're 20, you think you know everything. And then when you're 30, you find out you don't know everything. But by the time you're 35, you know it again.
Mm.
And I like a quote that I use quite often, which is, if you're the same person at 50 that you were at 20, you've wasted 30 years. Well, it was a learning experience for me. And being involved with law enforcement for 42 years full time, you would think I should know better. I didn't see this kind of stuff going on when I was in law enforcement. If there's 700,000 of us, you're not. You're only going to see what's in your window in front of you. So yeah, it was eye-opening, very much so. And the one thing I'll say about the innocence programs, I think they're doing a great job, the lawyers and so forth, investigators. But if you keep taking the innocent people out at one end, they're still coming in the other. The innocent people that are incarcerated are not the problem. They're a symptom of the problem. It's how they get there. That's the problem. And at the same time, like this case in Texas I told you about, because when you put the innocent person in jail, what happens to the real guilty person? They're out there committing more crimes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thought that flashed into my head just now as you were saying that is there was a case here in Utah that a man raped a female, and because it took 8 months to get the DNA from the rape kit back, it took 8 months, which is crazy. You'd think a high violent crime, basically like rape, they would be able to move that DNA through the system faster, but the crime lab was just so backlogged. It took 8 months. Well, in that 8-month period, by the time they were able to actually arrest him, he had raped three more women. And so those 3 women that their lives are shattered now, they basically, and it shouldn't have been. I mean, they should have never been, this guy should have never been on the streets. And they knew who it was, but because they didn't have the actual physical evidence yet, they weren't ready to go to trial. They couldn't convict him without the physical evidence. Then, yeah, he was still walking out on the streets and was able to have, totally ruin the lives of 3 more victims. Well, you got to wonder when the wrong guy is in jail for 25 years and the actual killer is still roaming around. It's not like this guy turns into a priest and, then leads a nice life. This
Yes.
guy's, especially once they've actually killed somebody, what else do they have to lose?
You
that
see,
they're out there. Yeah.
talking
That
about
they're out
the
there just, doing bad things. So,
yeah, talking
Yep.
about the DNA. This is a side story. One of the persons that we interviewed during this research was a high-ranking officer in the Midwest, I'll say, and he had a terrific story that was never published because, like I say, we didn't get enough on this last research project. But he retired from the department and he took a job as a chief in a department, I'll just say miles away, but in the same state. And the first thing he got there, he found there were 600 rape kits that had never been tested.
Mm.
And the first thing he did was have all these kits tested. And you have to say to yourself, there's probably a dozen or so people responsible for 20% of these cases.
Yeah.
And it's like the old commercial with the oil change. You can pay me now or pay me later for a new oil filter.
Okay.
Well, if the police are funded correctly, and they do, and I believe the bad police should be held accountable. But that's what you have to do. You can't shortchange that and then expect to have a good system. You're always going to have problems. Like I say, we're human.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel the same responsibility should be within the administration of police. When George Floyd was killed, the officer knelt on his neck for 19 minutes. And he had 3 field training officers, new officers being field trained with him, under him, that day. Now, I don't know if the reports are correct, but if it's true that he had 17 complaints in 19 years of excessive force, why was he a field training officer?
Right.
He should not have been there. Now, like I say, I don't know that to be a fact, but you see that kind of pattern quite often where people let it go. They see one little misbehavior and they say, that's all right, that's all right. Where over the years, a lot of it, they expect not to be held responsible for anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sad part too.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty wild case. The part of the George Floyd case that disturbs me the most is one of those officers that was being trained. Wasn't he just thrown in prison? Like he was convicted of inaction or something, like he was an accomplice. But how many officers, especially if their field training officer is doing something, how many of them are going to turn around and tell the field training officer, to stop doing what they're doing? There's an intimidation factor, I think, that's involved there, along with, the superior and the officer that has the most experience. That's like somebody in a office setting, that's a low level, associate going up to the executive vice president and telling them to stop doing what they're doing. Everybody's a, super courageous and bold. And they're like, yeah, I would have told him to stop kneeling on George Floyd's neck, until they actually, personalize it and then say, well, really? You, so when you see your boss doing something that you think is a little shady, you automatically walk up and tell them to stop. And that doesn't happen.
It's been said many times. One of the biggest lies in law enforcement is, if I'd have been there. People always think that, but I'll give you an example. I mean, we have a culture that it should be that when you get out of an academy and you get with the field training officer should be saying to you, everything you learned in the academy is what we're going to do, but we're going to refine it. We're going to make it better. Instead, you have a lot of field officers saying, forget what you learned in the academy. I'll teach you how to be a real police officer. Well, that shouldn't be a field training officer. When you hire somebody for a 25 or 30-year career, you should invest in them so you have the best training and the best field training officers, because then you have that good officer for 25, 30 years. Instead, if you're just trying to fill the egg carton and you let people come through either the academy training or field training, then you have the problems like you do. And I realize that departments are having a hard time hiring people. You have departments paying great bonuses just to get people. But I would rather work with 6 or 7 super good officers than I would 10 where half of them were iffy. I mean, that's just my thoughts on that. And at the same time, like you say, who goes from the bottom to the top to say, hey, you're making a mistake? We have a history in this country of creating laws to protect whistleblowers. And whistleblower has a terrible reputation with it, as if it's something terrible and wrong.
Right.
And it's sad. There's a case in New York. It's in the book, but it's not in a summary case. I just mentioned it in the epilogue, where a female officer tries to stop a male officer from choking a handcuffed subject because they have rules against chokeholds. She tried to tell him to stop and he wouldn't, so she interfered with it, and a bunch of other officers jumped in. They ended up charging her with violation of departmental policies. And because she wouldn't plead guilty, she went to a trial board and she was fired. Now, 15 years later, the court said, no, you owe her all her back pay and you owe her retirement. So all the other officers that are there that see that, especially the ones with a young spouse, maybe a couple kids, they can't afford to lose the job. They look at it like, I don't want to do that. So that's part of that culture. And it's sad because if officers are so afraid to report other officers, you're never going to have that. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And then when it does happen, the public says, why'd you let this happen? Why'd you let this happen? Well,
if only I had been there. Right.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
That's the thing is, and that kind of goes back to what we were originally talking about, at the beginning, is there's no other occupation or profession that I've ever seen that the entire profession is demonized based on the actions of the one. And it's, like you said, everybody's a keyboard warrior, an armchair warrior when it comes to this kind of stuff. And, I have a military background and the military's kind of the same. We didn't interact with the public, the same way that law enforcement does. And so there wasn't near the opportunities that, of mistakes happening like what law enforcement has. But at the same time, the violence and the potential for things to go sideways really quick is so dramatic that I don't think most people understand how it's hard to describe, on edge or sketchy, just the different scenarios that law enforcement run into every single day with every single interaction with the public. That how many times as a Maryland state police state police officer did you have a really friendly, hey, I'm having the best thank you for pulling me over, this is such a wonderful treat, that you are interacting with me right now. It's like it just doesn't happen. And so you're,
I,
go ahead.
I filled out a questionnaire for a podcast, and one of the questions was uh, how things happened in your career, events, that kind of stuff, and what are you thankful for? And surprisingly, I think back about a couple times where I did something for people. I mean, even changing a flat tire or something, and I got letters for it. In other words, people just thought it was enough that you were there. I picked a lady up off the road one time that had been assaulted, probably by her husband. Uh, and I was working in intelligence at the time, and she didn't trust me. I didn't look like a police officer, but I had a business card and a badge. So she got in the car, and I took her home, and it was snowing. This is Christmas time.
Mm.
And I met her husband at the door. And I said to her in front of her husband, if anybody touches you, this is my card. You call me, and I'll come lock them up. Well, a week later, I got my handkerchief back that I'd given her, all cleaned with a nice note. Uh, those things mean a lot.
Yeah.
That part. And I guess you're right. People just expect you to be there and do the right thing. And there is no other job where you get criticized like this, everybody for the same thing. But you're so seen, you're obvious, you're there right in front of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you could do 99 things right and one thing wrong, and it's bad. It is a strange career. I'm glad I had it. I consider myself very fortunate to not only have the career with the state police, then the FBI, the research. I mean, I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
I never advertised as an expert. I never wanted to be an expert witness as a money making thing. But because of articles that I had written, that's what I got called for.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, the case for this Judicial Soup, that's exactly how it happened. A couple articles that I had written fit the narrative, off-duty behavior, that type of stuff.
Wow.
But
Well,
sometimes you're
Shannon,
just
I gotta ask you now. After all this research, all of your experience, and I think a fairly unique way of looking into, especially wrongful incarcerations, and what's the answer?
I think you need, and I say this sincerely, and this is also in the book, it's mentioned. I think there should be a commission on looking at the false convictions, just like the research we did on assaults on police officers. If you want to find out how not to have these innocent people in jail, you look at how they got there, and then you can have training for that effect. And then also the state law boards and county and so forth, you need to change some laws where the attorney that withholds evidence is responsible. There was a prosecutor that had somebody in jail for 30 years. And when he was interviewed, he said he'd do it all again, the same thing. But there's no responsibility for him.
Yeah.
If you're going to have that authority, then you have to have the responsibility. And I think putting a light on it, on the idea that the system, how it works or how it doesn't work, you can correct it. I really believe that. For the police, I think it starts with the person you hire. And I realize this is a really difficult time, but you need to hire the best person, and you need the best training, and the training has to be reinforced, not only with the field training officer, but with the supervisor. You want these young officers coming out and the field training officer to say, everything you learned, we're going to do better now.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a field training officer who is put there because they're such a screw up, they don't want them someplace else, you're hurting your whole career. You're that guy's person's career. I mean, think of it like building a house.
Well, and you're hurting
The
your
footer
department
is
too.
that training. Huh?
You're hurting your department.
Yes. And some people just shouldn't be in that job, maybe. But I'm not, again, I go back to the fact that I feel the majority of officers do a good job.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the majority of prosecutors do too. But you have to take that. If you want justice, equality for everyone, then you have to do that. It has to be that way.
Yeah.
And
No, you
there's
can't.
directions to go.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I've always been an advocate for, and especially in the law enforcement field, because it's so critical and it's so when you are interacting with the public in a law enforcement capacity, your that interaction is so critical that you just can't afford the screw ups because and a lot of these screw ups happen because sometimes in order to fill a quota they'll lower the standards, and it's usually those officers. Well, a perfect example, I think in Memphis, at the Memphis PD, when what was the guy's Tyree Nichols, I think was the
Yes.
victim's name. So I think that is a perfect example where Memphis was having trouble uh, filling the ranks. And so they hired these guys, and these five thugs basically, get one of them has a personal interaction or a personal, um, maybe not interaction, but a, connection with Tyree Nichols. And when that whole thing goes south and those five officers literally beat him to death, that is because those five officers were not vetted properly. And, there were things in their past that I guarantee the hiring process did not vet properly. And, but again, how many, how many people in completely the other side of the country were blamed and demonized and frowned upon that happen to be cops but did nothing wrong. They do everything that they're supposed to do in the way that they should in a professional manner, and yet they are frowned upon simply because of these five guys in Memphis, Tennessee. And I am I somewhere in the neighborhood there?
I agree with you 100%. I had a neighbor, retired veterinarian. He asked me about that incident, Tyree Nichols. And this is when it first happened. And I said, I'm sure when they look into the background, I would feel almost positive that these people have a history of this behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me a sideways look. And I had no premonition for any of this. Uh, and then a couple of weeks later, I see him again. He said, "You were right." And I said, "That's fine. What was I right about?" You forget the conversation. And he said, all five of those officers had a history of being disciplined for excessive force.
Mm-hmm.
And I says, well, they call it progressive discipline, but it's not. In other words, they don't want to lose the egg in the carton. And it's true. I'm sure that these officers, as well as many others, have a history of this behavior, and they're probably responsible for a lot of the bad will that we encounter. But officers don't want to turn them in. They don't want to be fired for, you know, telling somebody not to use a chokehold.
Yeah.
And that's a culture that has to change if it's going to change at all. But I do believe that you could, like I say, there's ways to do this, and I think it's good. What I don't like is the general idea that police need reform. So what we do is we take every apple out of the barrel. We look at each one. We put the good ones back, and the bad ones we say, okay, we'll train these people. Well, you shouldn't have the bad apples in the barrel to begin with. You start with that. I'm aware of a case where an officer was fired. Well, not fired. He went to jail actually for shooting somebody and killing them.
Mm-hmm.
But in his background, he had so many complaints and suspensions and problems that when you looked at it, you said he should have never been hired.
Yeah.
And when these incidents occurred, he should have been fired. But yet he went through 11 years of that.
Mm.
And the department, well, he's in jail now. I mean, because he shot this man. But one of the incidents he was involved in is he was in a traffic accident and he had no insurance. So the man that he's in the accident with, the other vehicle, insists on having insurance. So he draws his gun out and shoots the guy and hits him in the foot. And he was still in the job. And I'm thinking, why? that should be enough to say you're not a responsible person.
You think?
You know,
Yeah. Well,
so
I
it's a
want
big
to
discussion.
let me expand just a little bit and get your opinion on it.
Okay.
You talk about the apples in the barrel, but it's also partly the barrel. And what I mean by that is the city itself, the DA, the entire process. They all have to support each other. And I think in cities like Memphis, it's just I was just in Memphis just a few weeks ago, and I was training the Memphis TBI crime lab on using our system, and so I took a day and I was walking around. We have a podcast actually that just came out. By the time you're hearing this, you'll know that we had a new podcast about the West Memphis Three, that case in where the three boys were murdered. Well, the problem with Memphis used to be right in par with Nashville, but the problem was uh, Memphis has kind of moved further and further to the liberal side, and therefore the mayor, the DA, the entire barrel, the entire support structure around the police agencies or the police agency itself, the Memphis PD, is so. I think the barrel itself has rot around it, and that is in turn spoiling some of the apples, but it's also allowing some of those bad apples in, and so the good apples are just being overwhelmed, and in to use our analogy, but I think in Memphis itself, you look at Nashville because Nashville hasn't, lurched quite as much to the left. But most importantly, around Nashville is very, very law enforcement friendly and very conservative. And they put the resources that they need into their agencies. Whereas I don't think the Memphis area does. I mean, Memphis and Nashville used to be right on par with each other. But in the last 20, 30 years, Memphis has gone one direction and Nashville has gone the completely other. And Nashville is now this booming economy, and Memphis has the highest per capita murder rate in the entire country. And so you have to look back at everything that contributed to that and say, okay, let's objectively stand back and be honest with ourselves and figure out what exactly happened. And I just think that when you get into those anti-law enforcement type of environments that a lot of the big cities in the United States have right now, you are going to see those kind of problems just integrated within the system.
I agree with you. And part of the issue there that we didn't discuss is the history and how this stuff occurs. Uh, when you look at long range planning, and I say long range planning from selection of an officer to training all the way through, uh, you're dealing also with limited finances and resources and with limited politicians that allow that. In other words, if you're the mayor for 8 years, but then you leave and somebody else comes in, which is normal, that's part of a democracy, you have to have a way of saying to the department or to the politicians, this is why we're doing it. This is why we're keeping and maintaining this. You remember Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, Missouri?
Oh yeah.
The Attorney General Eric Holder's report on that shooting was an eye opener. People in both directions saw it, and sometimes where they saw it from, they couldn't have seen it. And one said the officer was bad, and one said the Michael Brown was bad. In other words, it was an excellent report because they documented everything. Even people passed what they saw and then put it together. So it was not, I won't say it was a good shooting, but it was a legal shooting.
Mm-hmm.
But the report on the department was terrible. And it's when you read the report on the department, I said to my wife, I knew that there were racist or some bigot officers out there, but I never thought it would be a whole agency. Well, later I thought about it and I said, there's probably a lot of officers on that agency that aren't racist or bigots, but they're not going to say anything to the other officers that are.
Mm-hmm.
And then, if what I read correctly, I was really surprised when George Floyd was killed. The chief of Ferguson, along with the protesters, marched together in protest of that killing. So change can occur, and it does occur. And you're right about that, about the direction it takes. Because if you have a series of chiefs that aren't really interested, they just want the position. They're not going to invest what's 20 years down the road. They want the acolytes now. And that's part of the issue. I would like to see, especially large police departments, have professional managers within the agency that help direct them instead of just all police. Because they're going to look at it from a future point perspective.
Yeah.
How we invest now for the training, how we invest in the future. And I think you would see a much different policing. But again, and you're absolutely correct, if a police messes up, they're all bad. It's
yeah. Well,
I will say this, that
yeah.
in the academy I went through, the State Police Academy, and what I've taught since then, I've always said that when you interact with people, you treat them the way you want your family members to be treated if they're stopped on the road. And at the same time, you have a plan to instantly do them great bodily harm if necessary. And that's how it works. In the research we conducted, we had several offenders that killed police officers. And when they described the officers they killed, they would say stuff like, well, he really wasn't in charge of the situation. He was just a participant in the situation. In one case, a man went out to kill a police officer because they were interfering with his business, which was manufacturing chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the only person to go out to kill a police officer, didn't even have a weapon with him. So as it turns out, there's an accident in front of him on this street corner, and an officer, not a staged accident, the officer shows up. He looks at that man, says, piece of cake, goes out, pushes the guy to the ground, assaults him, takes his gun out of the holster and shoots him and kills him. Well, later when he's being interviewed, Ed Davis, a friend of mine who's since passed away, did the interview. And he says to this man, I want to know what you did the day before and the day after, just like any crime that you do that. Well, it turns out when he went to this gas station because he wanted to kill a police officer, while he was there before the accident, another officer showed up at the gas station. He had a flat tire. They pulled his car into the garage and they changed the tire. So Ed says, well, why didn't you assault him? He said, well, I don't know. And he tried to get a physical description from this individual of why he wouldn't assault this officer. Was he bigger than you? Was he stronger than you? No. He just, he could not describe him. But sometimes I think police officers make themselves the target by being lax, not being aware of their surroundings, and not acting professional. I think this young officer, just the way he described him, was a sergeant actually, was squared away and looked good, whereas the officer that was shot did not appear that way. Ed had a long conversation with his supervisor about his evaluations, because here's a police officer that was on the job for maybe 10, 12 years, always had a good evaluation, and before this killing where he was killed, his evaluation dropped to needs improvement. Now, I look at it like, how bad do you have to be on a job 10 years to get an evaluation of needs improvement?
Right.
And
Wow.
It turns out that prior to this, he was with another officer on the street, and another offender came up and took his gun out of the holster, and his partner shot and killed him. So
his head just wasn't in it.
No.
Wow. That's scary.
But there's a number of lessons there.
Mm-hmm.
You have to look professional, you have to act professional, but you have to be ready to do what you have to do.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you say that, because I think that level of situational awareness wears people down. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of people that initially are all fired up about being law enforcement and serving the community, I think over time, especially if they're in an area that they're underappreciated, if not reviled, and it just wears you down. You just can't, you can't keep that situational awareness up that long. And it's unfortunate. I know a lot of these officers that are in that situation. Maybe they have a house payment, their kids are in school, uh,
Yes.
doing something else, changing a career or changing departments, just may not be an option. And so, they become lax and become worn down and therefore become vulnerable. But um, yeah, I don't know what the what the answer is exactly, but I'll tell you, I was just reading an article this morning that I'm originally from Idaho, and if you've never been there, it's just an absolute gorgeous state. But there are cops flocking to Idaho and Utah and Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, places like that are in the middle of the country, and a lot of them are coming from the coastal states because it's such a not just law enforcement friendly, but the people themselves are much more oriented around self-sufficiency and the individual responsibility, and that just leads to an environment that is much safer. They may not get paid nearly as much, but being able to be in a community where they actually appreciate law enforcement versus some place like Portland where you're literally your life is right on the edge every single day. um I'd take a pay cut to do that.
Well, I think that what you said earlier about wearing yourself out, uh, I think that you develop habits when you're young, like watching hands, that kind of stuff. And even after retiring, I still watch people,
Hmm.
and it's just a habit. I was in another city with my wife, and it was a tourist area. And she says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, do you see that guy across the street?" And she started turning. I said, "Don't look at him, just see him at an angle." She says, "Yeah." I said, "He's looking to break into one of those cars." And she said, "Well, how do you know that?" I says, "Well, it's summertime. It's 80 degrees out. He's got a long coat on, and he's only got one arm because the other arm's got the Slim Jim or the tire iron in it. But he's going down the street looking at each car."
Yeah.
And I said, "And that's what he's going to do." And he kept on going because he didn't find what he wanted. But you see these things, you cannot. I can't stop it. It's just a habit.
Yeah.
I look for people when they're carrying a gun, and it's just things that you did. I mean, so sometimes it can be a habit, and that can be a good thing, even if you're retired.
Hmm.
Uh, so, and some people I don't think ever get into the habit like you're talking about, and they get so stressed with it. Uh, it is a difference, and it is a difference where you work. I mean, I've been to Idaho a couple times. I mean, it's a gorgeous state,
Yeah.
gorgeous. Uh, yes.
Well, there's lots of beauty. I mean, all over, doesn't matter where you are. I mean, Maryland's
Hmm.
a pretty nice state too. I tell you, I've got some friends out there that um, went kayaking on a Maryland river up there around Fallon a few summers ago, and I'll tell you that's just gorgeous out there. But at the same time, um, there's give and takes for every situation and every
Yes.
community. And I was just out in Orlando yesterday, and I'll tell you, uh, beautiful areas. I was south of Orlando about almost an hour, so gorgeous out there. But I'll tell you, I just cannot deal with that heat. So you know, we give and take. Of course, when I tell my Florida friends that we got 600 inches of snow in our mountains, they just lose their minds. They're like, "No way! I'll take the summer heat of Florida over that anytime." So Well, Shannon, any last thoughts on the message of your book?
I think it has to be a long-term approach. It's not a quick fix. But I think if you look at the whole system and you only look at the police, you're looking at one tire of four, and you're not looking at the body or the engine. I think you have to look at the whole system and how it works. And I agree with you. I couldn't live in Florida. It's just too hot.
Well, I'll honestly, I'll take their law enforcement atmosphere down there, way above Maryland. But as far as just the beauty overall, it's probably sixes. So, Shannon, I appreciate it. Again, the book is Judicial Soup, and I hope everybody goes and jumps on Amazon right now and gets a copy of it. I'm waiting for my copy, and as soon as I get it, I can't wait to review some of these stories that we've talked about. So, Shannon, sure appreciate you coming on, and appreciate your service, sir. And
Thank you.
definitely, if I'm ever out in Maryland, I'll give you a call.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.